The oncology wing of Oak Creek Memorial smelled like antiseptic and surrender. Natalie Hayes moved through the fluorescent-lit corridors at 5 in the morning, before the morning shift doctors arrived, before the families gathered in waiting rooms with hope still intact. She preferred the quiet hours. The machines beeped their steady rhythms. The 4 pumps hummed. Nobody asked questions about the precise way her hands moved or why she could thread a central line with the kind of muscle memory that came from somewhere other than nursing school. Her badge read N. Hayes, RN, and nothing else. That was intentional. 23 years she'd kept her head down. 23 years since she'd traded combat boots for compression socks, since she'd stopped introducing herself with a rank that meant something in the language of small unit tactics and everything meant nothing in the language of hospital hierarchies. The boots themselves sat in the trunk of her car, wrapped in plastic, unlaced and waiting in the dark the way she'd learned to wait in Tikrit, patient, ready, invisible until the moment invisibility became a liability. She checked the 4 on room for 02, an 84-year-old man named Morrison with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. His daughter slept in the vinyl chair beside his bed, her head bent at an angle that would give her neck pain by morning. Natalie adjusted the morphine drip by 0.2 milliliters, a movement so minute that neither the machines nor the daughter stirred. The monitor read steady. Pain was information. Pain was data. Suppressing it required precision. The chart for room for 03 caught her attention as she passed the station, a readmission case, chemotherapy dosages logged twice for the same patient on the same day. She pulled the electronic record, scrolling backward through dates. August 15th. 2 injections of doxorubicin documented. But she remembered this patient. Remembered the daughter making funeral arrangements by phone at the end of the corridor. The man had coded out for days before the second dosage appeared in the system. Natalie's jaw tightened. She didn't move. Didn't make a sound. Just kept reading. Room for 05 showed the same pattern. Room for 08. Room for 10. The phantom dosages were consistent, always in the afternoon, always for patients whose final charts had already been closed, whose insurance companies had already been contacted about final billing. She ran the numbers in her head, the kind of arithmetic that came from counting spent ammunition and confirming head counts. 7 patients. 7 duplicate charges. At $3,000 per infusion, that was $42,000 in claims that existed nowhere except in the hospital's billing system and Medicare's payment records. The overbilling was systematic. Methodical. Professional. She closed the chart and resumed her rounds. There would be time to think about what she'd found. There always was. Thinking required distance and distance required patience, and patience was the one thing Natalie Hayes had trained herself to possess in abundance. By 6:15, the night shift was ending and the day shift was beginning their arrival, nurses signing in, doctors checking overnight notes, the hospital shifting its weight like a sleeping animal that knew something was coming. Natalie was charting medication administration times when Dr. Hargrove arrived in the oncology wing. She didn't look up. Looking up required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement opened conversations, and conversations were something she'd learned to minimize somewhere between her second and third deployment. But Hargrove stopped at her station. She felt the presence before she heard him, the way the air pressure changed, the way the other nurse's conversation volume dropped incrementally. She kept her attention on the screen. "Impressive work on the Morrison 4, he said. "Not a question." His voice carried the kind of confidence that came from knowing he'd never been questioned. "Most nurses need 2 attempts on that guy's veins. You threaded it on the first try." "He has good veins," Natalie said quietly. Still not looking up. The truth but not the whole truth. Morrison's veins were average at best. What she had were hands that had sutured open arteries in field hospitals with nothing but a headlamp and muscle memory holding them steady. Morrison's veins were trivial. Hargrove smiled. He leaned against the station counter and she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive, the kind of scent worn by men who believed smell was the same thing as presence. "You know, I've been watching you for a while now. 2 years in this wing and you barely say a word. You just work. Steady. Quiet. He paused. Where did you learn to move like that? It was a casual question. The kind of question that should have had a casual answer. Community college. Online certification. Some combination of YouTube and textbooks and the relentless need to survive in a profession where most people burned out within 5 years. Natalie finally looked at him. His eyes were sharp, calculating, already assembling something behind the smile. Practice, she said. A lot of practice. Must be. He reached toward her wrist, toward the sleeve of her scrubs, and something in her body registered the movement as threat even though his touch was light, his manner casual. He pushed her sleeve back just far enough to see the thin white lines running up her inner forearm, scars like the tracks of something precise and metallic passing through flesh. Surgical scars. She'd gotten careless about covering them. Those are interesting. Looks like someone put you back together pretty carefully. Natalie pulled her arm back without urgency. No jerking movement. No sudden breath. Just a withdrawal, the way water recedes from the shore. Minor procedure. Long time ago. Hargrove's smile widened. He was still staring at her forearm, at the scars, as if they were text he was trying to decode. You know what I do in my spare time, Hayes? I check credentials. Online records. Public databases. I like to know who I'm working with. I knew, he paused, waiting to see if she would fill the silence. Your nursing transcript is solid but nothing exceptional. Your certifications are current. Your employment history is spotless. But there's this gap. For years right after college where you just disappeared from any kind of official record. No job listings. No tax documents that I can find. Nothing. The room did not feel smaller. The monitors did not sound louder. Her heart did not accelerate. These were the reactions he was looking for and Natalie gave him none of them. I took time off, she said. People do that. People do, he agreed. But not usually people with scars like that. Not usually people who thread a central line on the first try and move through a code like they've already been rehearsing it their whole life. He stepped back, the smile still in place but something different underneath it now. Something that looked like recognition mixed with calculation. You have a good shift, Hayes. And if you ever want to talk about where those scars came from, I'm a good listener. He left before she could respond, moving toward the nursing station where the day shift was gathering. Natalie didn't watch him go. She turned back to her charting and forced her breathing to remain exactly as it had been, steady, unremarkable, the breathing of someone with nothing to hide and therefore nothing worth hiding. Around 7 o'clock, she signed out her patients to the day shift nurse, a younger woman named Priya who moved with the careful deliberation of someone still learning which shortcuts were safe and which ones were dangerous. Natalie gave her the report, medications, vitals, any outstanding orders, and Priya took notes with a kind of focus that meant she was still frightened of making mistakes. Natalie remembered that feeling. Remembered when every patient interaction had carried the weight of consequence. That had been a different life, though. A different Natalie. The parking garage was empty at 7:30, her footsteps echoing off concrete in a way that made her think of Bagram Airfield at dawn, the way sound traveled differently when most people were still asleep. She unlocked her trunk and there they were, the combat boots, wrapped in plastic, the leather darkened by dust from 100 patrols, the soles worn down in a pattern that matched the way she'd walked for 12 years. 3 tours. That's all they'd tell you if you asked. 3 tours and whatever came after, the parts that didn't fit into neat medical terminology or discharge paperwork. She touched the plastic but didn't unwrap it. Some things were better left wrapped. Her phone buzzed as she was closing the trunk. A text from the hospital IT department. Dr. Hargrove has requested access to personnel files for oncology wing staff. Approved by administration. Natalie read the message twice and then deleted it. Later that evening, she sat in her apartment, sparse, minimal, a place designed to be vacated quickly if necessary, and opened her personal laptop. The billing records for Oak Creek Memorial were supposed to be secure. They were encrypted. They required authentication protocols and access logs and administrative oversight. But Natalie had spent enough time in enough secure facilities to know that security was usually only as good as the person implementing it, and the person implementing it usually assumed that people on the inside wouldn't look too hard at what they were looking at. The pattern was even clearer from the outside. 7 phantom dosages over the course of 6 months. 7 deceased patients with post-mortem treatment claims. $42,000 in fraudulent billing. It wasn't the biggest scheme she'd ever heard of. It wasn't complicated. It was just efficient, the work of someone who understood that small crimes repeated often enough looked like legitimate billing errors, like the kind of administrative mistakes that happened in every hospital in America every single day. What she didn't understand yet was why Hargrove had approached her at the station. Why he'd asked about the scars. Why he'd had her employment records pulled. She knew what it meant, though. She'd spent enough time in situations where people noticed what they weren't supposed to notice. And what happened next usually involved choices, the kind of choices that had consequences that echoed across years. The rain started around midnight, heavy and relentless, hammering the windows of her apartment like applause for something she'd already agreed to, whether she'd agreed to it consciously or not. Natalie lay in bed and listened to it, and thought about combat boots wrapped in plastic, and thought about surgical scars on her forearms that told stories she didn't want to tell, and thought about the precise moment when it became impossible to keep being invisible because someone was looking too hard and starting to see. Morning rounds at Oak Creek Memorial started at 6:45 when the hallway lights hadn't quite warmed to full brightness and the coffee in the break room was still hot enough to burn. The oncology conference room held 18 people that Tuesday, attending physicians, residents, nurses, a medical student with a notebook, and the kind of institutional silence that only exists in hospitals before the day cracks open. Dr. Hargrove stood at the head of the table in a charcoal suit that cost more than most nurses made in 2 weeks, his silver cufflinks catching the fluorescent light like a predator's teeth. He was 53, with a kind of face that had never learned to look worried, only dismissive, only certain. Natalie sat 3 chairs from the door, her scrub still damp from the pre-dawn supply closet she used to change in so nobody would see her transition from the woman who slept in her car to the woman who belonged in these rooms. Her hands rested flat on the table. Steady. Invisible. New admissions, Hargrove said, moving through the list with the kind of efficiency that suggested he'd memorized patient histories without actually reading them. Then he paused. Smiled. Our friend here. He gestured toward Natalie without looking at her. The quiet one. The eager one. The one pushing mops in some other hospital 6 months ago. The laughter started in the back, a resident first, then 2 attending physicians, that particular sound of people who understand themselves as superior and have found permission to broadcast it. I'll tell you what. I'll bet $50 our little Florence Nightingale here quits within a week. She's got that look. Too soft for the real work. Too much conscience. Doesn't fit. He turned to face her directly then, his jaw relaxed, his eyes empty as a shark's. Am I right? The room waited. Natalie took one measured breath through her nose. Her jaw tightened, the kind of tightness you get from clenching down on words that would change everything. She didn't look at him. She didn't break eye contact. She simply remained present in her own body while the laughter rolled past her like a wave, and she said nothing. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else shuffled papers. The moment stretched thin and then snapped, and Hargrove moved on to the next patient as if he'd already forgotten her. But he hadn't. That was the thing that made her spine stiffen later. When she understood it, Hargrove didn't make bets he wasn't confident about. He didn't announce things casually. He was testing something. Measuring her. Watching for the fracture point. The cafeteria at noon was chaos, 100 people in a space designed for 60, the lunch line crushing toward the steam tables, the smell of industrial bleach mixing with overcooked chicken and the wet cotton dust scent of hot plastic. Natalie stood in line with a tray and took soup, tomato, because it was less likely to stain, and a salad that nobody had touched yet. She found a corner table near the window, where the morning light had gone thin and grey, and she opened a text on her phone about Medicare reimbursement protocols. Her hands were reading the words. Her mind was somewhere else. Hargrove appeared between one breath and the next. He didn't sit. Didn't speak. He simply walked past her table with the precision of someone who'd done this calculation in his head multiple times, and he caught the edge of her tray with his wrist as he passed. The movement was casual. Deniable. The tray flipped, not dramatically, not in slow motion, but with the sudden horizontal physics of gravity asserting itself. Soup cascaded across her scrubs. The bowl hit the table rim and shattered. The spoon clattered across the floor like a tiny bell announcing the moment. Conversation stopped in a 15-foot radius. People stared. Hargrove kept walking without turning, didn't say a word, didn't acknowledge the event at all. He simply moved toward the exit as if he'd been alone the whole time. Natalie sat there with tomato soup soaking into the cotton at her ribs, the smell of it rising hot and acidic. Her hands remained flat on the table. Someone from the next table offered napkins. She thanked them quietly and stood, removing her scrubs with a kind of efficiency that suggested she did this regularly. Which she did. The incident was deniable. Accidental. Nothing that would hold in a complaint. But that wasn't the worst part. Worse was the knowledge settling into her chest like sediment. He was escalating. He wasn't trying to humiliate her in front of crowds randomly. He was establishing a pattern. Making her visible. Making her someone other people noticed, which meant making her someone who had a problem, because people who have problems don't belong in institutions. The nurse's station at 3:15 during shift change was chaos, 18 people moving between posts, phones ringing, computer screens glowing with discharge summaries and new orders. Natalie was charting in the overflow area, her fresh scrubs from her locker still crisp, when Hargrove emerged from the main corridor with a patient chart in his hand. He didn't slow. Didn't calculate. He simply released the chart from waist height, and it sailed downward through the air in a flat arc, paper scattered across the tile floor in a corona of white. Other staff looked away immediately, the kind of practiced ignorance that comes from wanting to keep your job. "Pick that up, sweetheart." Hargrove's voice was a smile made audible. "Or is bending over too much real work for you?" The room went dead silent. Not the absence of sound but the presence of held breath, 5 nurses, 3 residents, a unit secretary all locked in position like a photograph. Natalie stared at him for 3 seconds. 4. 5. Her hands were trembling. Not from fear. The trembling was restraint, the compression of every response that would have ended careers, that would have shattered the institutional fiction he was building. She let one tear escape down her cheek, the physical equivalent of releasing pressure, and she wiped it away without breaking his gaze. Then she kneeled to gather the papers. Her movements were deliberate. Slow. The kind of deliberate that made clear she was choosing each motion. She stood, holding the reorganized chart, and met Hargrove's eyes. "I've carried wounded men through minefields." Her voice was like still water, no tremor, no edge, just absolute flatness. "Your cruelty is remarkably light." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Hargrove's jaw tightened, a visible clench of the masseter muscle, the kind of involuntary response you get when someone has said something you can't unsay and can't ignore in front of witnesses. His eye contact broke first. He turned and walked away without another word, and the room exhaled in that moment the way a room does when something fundamental has shifted. Natalie returned to her charting as if nothing had happened. Her hands were steady. The other nurses didn't look at her, but their attention had changed, shifted from dismissal to something else, something quieter and more careful. The unit secretary, a woman named Priya, found her later near the supply closet and simply squeezed her arm without speaking. That evening, during the quiet hours when most patients were medicated and the hospital became a place of monitoring rather than intervention, a man arrived by ambulance with a tattoo on his left shoulder. The intake report said disabled Marine veteran, shrapnel complications, multiple embedded fragments from an IED detonation in Tikrit 14 years prior. His name was Marcus Webb, and his file included discharge papers from Walter Reed and a notation about chronic pain management and partial disability. He was 41 years old. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved out of stone and then smoothed by salt water. Natalie saw his chart in the oncology overflow wing, where patients waited for beds when the main wards were full, and she glanced at the unit tattoo printed there. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. Her hand stopped moving for one breath. Just one. Then she continued with the shift set up as if the image meant nothing, which it didn't, because nothing from before belonged in this place, and she had worked too hard to make sure that was true. Webb was assigned to her care for the evening rounds. He watched her approach his bed with the kind of attention that people give to things they're trying to categorize, trying to place. There was nothing threatening in it, just recognition seeking recognition. She took his vitals with the professionalism of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Blood pressure 118/74. Heart rate 86. Oxygen saturation 97%. Respiration 16. Everything normal. Everything that suggested the human body was still willing to cooperate with the fact of existing. Later that night, during rounds at 11:30, she found Webb in distress, his chest rise too shallow, his color slightly gray. She assessed quickly. Tension building. A superficial bleeder on his left forearm wherein had infiltrated and was running cold saline into tissue instead of the vein. She called for supplies without waiting for a doctor's order, because waiting was not an option, and she began field pressure technique, the kind of pressure application that comes from understanding anatomy as a three-dimensional puzzle, from having learned to stop bleeding by knowing exactly where blood wanted to go and refusing to let it go there. Her hands moved on their own. Muscle memory was just another name for knowledge that had been installed so deeply that thinking wasn't required. She stabilized the site with pressure, with angle, with the kind of precision that comes from having done this while things were exploding and time wasn't measured in minutes but in seconds of consciousness remaining. Webb watched her hands work. His eyes widened. Not from pain but from something else, the moment when he understood what he was witnessing. "You learned that downrange," he said. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered with the certainty of someone who had seen it before. Natalie met his eyes for a moment, just a moment, and offered him only the smallest smile. She said nothing. But Webb kept staring, recognition building in his expression like pressure inside a closed room, and she understood in that instant that the boundary she had built between her past and her present had just developed a hairline fracture. It wasn't a problem yet. But it was going to be. Meanwhile, in the administrative wing on the 3rd floor, Dr. Hargrove sat in his office with the lights off except for the glow of his computer monitor. His hands moved through databases with the fluid efficiency of someone who had been accessing patient billing records for years without scrutiny. He knew the system. He knew the thresholds. He knew exactly how much overbilling could happen before algorithms flagged it and how many deceased patients could generate phantom chemotherapy charges before anyone outside his network noticed. What he wasn't supposed to know was that someone was looking. The discrepancies were small, dosages that didn't correlate with patient weight, treatments billed after death dates, reimbursements processed for patients who had been deceased for 48 hours. Notes in the system. Documentation. Questions asked by someone with access and attention. Hargrove's jaw tightened as he scrolled. His hands made a fist. Then he reached for his phone and dialed a number that wasn't in his official directory. "We have a problem," he said quietly. "The new nurse is asking questions." The line crackled. Someone on the other end was listening. "I can handle it," Hargrove said. "But I need to move faster." He ended the call and sat in the dark for a long moment, his face illuminated only by the cold glow of the screen, and his expression was the kind of expression that suggests someone has just crossed from discomfort into active calculation, from casual cruelty into something structured and deliberate. The shift in his demeanor wasn't visible to anyone but himself. But it was complete. Marcus Webb's monitor started singing a different song at 14:16. Natalie was at the supply cart near the nurse's station when she heard it, not the steady beep-beep-beep of normal sinus rhythm, but the erratic, fractured pattern of a heart running out of room. She moved toward his room without thinking, the way a dog's ears swivel toward a distant frequency only it can hear. The other nurses were still charting. The residents were still on their phones. Nobody else heard what Natalie heard because nobody else had spent 19 minutes holding a perimeter in Tikrit while her fire team bled out beside her, listening to the sounds a body makes when it's dying in increments. She was at Webb's bedside in 4 strides. His face had changed color, not the gray of shock, but the dusky blue-gray of a man whose oxygen was becoming a luxury. His neck veins bulged like they might detonate through the skin. Sweat pooled in the hollow of his collarbone. He was gasping, not breathing, pulling air in short, desperate bursts that his lungs could no longer process efficiently. "Marcus!" Her voice was steady. "Can you hear me?" He nodded, terrified. She pressed her stethoscope to his chest and found exactly what she expected, silence where there should have been sound. His heart murmurs, the ones that had been clearly audible yesterday, were gone. Muffled. As if someone had pressed a pillow against the organ itself. Pericardial tamponade. The shrapnel fragment that had been sitting dormant in his chest cavity had migrated during his sleep, and gravity had done the rest. It had drifted into the pericardium, the fluid sac surrounding his heart, and now that sac was filling with blood. His heart was being compressed from the outside in, suffocating in its own protective membrane. She reached for the call light, then stopped. The call light would summon a nurse. She needed a cardiologist. She needed imaging. She needed a procedure team. She needed doctors who weren't going to run. The overhead intercom crackled at her touch, cardiology to trauma bay. Stat pericardial tamponade, critical decompensation. The response came back in 14 seconds, which meant whoever was covering cardiology had been somewhere close. Natalie heard footsteps approaching from 3 different directions, the sound of shoes moving fast on tile, the rhythm of a hospital mobilizing. This was the moment she'd trained for in 3 different countries, the moment when muscle memory took over and the thinking part of her brain went offline. She was running a second for when they arrived, Dr. Hargrove first, because he was always first when there was a crisis to contain. Behind him came Dr. Chen from cardiothoracic, Dr. Patel from internal medicine, Dr. Morrison from emergency response, Dr. Kim from the cardiac step-down unit, Dr. Rodriguez from the resident pool, and Dr. Stevens from the attending staff. 7 doctors. 7 degrees of medical authority. 7 sets of eyes that looked at Marcus Webb's chart, calculated his odds, and decided they didn't like the numbers they found. Hargrove's glance lasted exactly 2 seconds. It traveled from Webb's face to his amputation prosthetic, resting against the wall, and then to the admissions notes. Disabled vet. Multiple complications. Injury sustained in Iraq, 2008. No family wealth evident. No insurance upgrade noted. The air pressure in the room changed. His blood pressure is dropping, Dr. Chen said, reading the monitor. 92/60. 88/50, Natalie corrected. Her hands hadn't stopped moving. For access, drawing labs, prepping the sterile field for the procedure that would need to happen in the next 3 minutes or Marcus Webb would have a myocardial infarction in front of his 13-year-old daughter, who was sitting in the waiting room with her mother. "What's your read?" Hargrove asked Dr. Chen, not Natalie. Pericardial fluid accumulation. Almost certainly hemorrhagic. The shrapnel migration caused a cardiac wall perforation. The prognosis is very poor. Transfer to UCSD trauma would be the standard protocol, but I'm uncertain he'd survive transport. Hargrove was already shaking his head. Too high risk, he said. The liability exposure is unacceptable. Initiate the transfer protocol. UCSD has the Level 1 trauma facility and the capacity to manage complications. We're a community hospital. This patient exceeds our capability threshold. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent. Someone's badge clattered against a metal railing when Dr. Kim shifted his weight. Webb's monitor continued its fractured song. 85/48 now. His lips were losing color. "He won't survive transport," Natalie said. Her voice came out flat and level, the way it always did when her brain was running calculations 17 steps ahead. "His pressure's too unstable. 40 minutes in an ambulance and his heart will arrest. He needs pericardiocentesis. 15 minutes. 1 needle. I can have him stable enough for transfer before the ambulance even arrives." Dr. Chen was frowning at the monitors, calculating the same equations. She's not wrong about the transport risk. A pericardial centesis would decompress the tamponade and expose us to a wrongful death lawsuit when the patient codes during the procedure, Hargrove said. His voice had the texture of still water, which meant he'd made a calculation of his own. Natalie understood then, in the way she understood battlefield terrain in seconds, what was happening. Webb was a liability. Webb's case was attached to something else, something Hargrove was protecting. The dead patients. The phantom dosages. The Medicare fraud that Natalie had documented, that was sitting in her personnel file like a loaded weapon. If Webb survived this crisis, he'd be compos mentis. He'd remember Natalie. He'd be able to testify. If Webb died, Natalie's credibility died with him. Hargrove wasn't refusing the procedure because it was risky. He was refusing it because he needed Webb to die in transit, away from Natalie's hands, where the cause of death could be blamed on the transfer itself. "His prognosis is poor regardless," Dr. Patel said, backing toward the door. "I concur with the transfer protocol. Liability concerns are significant." "I'm with cardio on this one," Dr. Rodriguez added, already stepping into the hallway. "Beyond our scope." Dr. Kim followed. Then Dr. Stevens. Dr. Morrison was the last, and he looked back at Webb with something that might have been regret before he turned and disappeared into the fluorescent-lit corridor. 6 doctors had exited. 7 had arrived. The arithmetic was becoming clear. Hargrove was still standing in the doorway, blocking the room like a gate. "What you're suggesting requires a physician's authorization," he said to Natalie. "And I'm not authorizing it. Step away from the patient. We have a transfer protocol now. That's your role in this situation, assist with transport prep. Nothing more." Webb's oxygen saturation was dropping. 84%. 82. The trajectory was a straight line down. Natalie set down the sterile field she'd been preparing and looked at Dr. Hargrove. Her eyes didn't flicker. Her shoulders didn't tense. Her voice didn't climb a single decibel. "I've carried wounded men through minefields," she said. "I've held arterial bleeders while mortar rounds hit the compound wall. I've sutured femoral injuries with field kit materials that would make your sterilization committee weep. I've seen what happens when 7 people decide a man's life isn't worth the effort. I'm going to tell you something, Dr. Hargrove, and I need you to listen carefully." She took 1 step toward him. "Get out of my way." The air between them crystallized. His face flushed, the anger of a man who'd never been spoken to like that, who believed his title was a force field that repelled defiance. For a moment, she thought he might physically block her. His hand moved toward her arm. But then something flickered across his eyes. Some recognition of what he was looking at. Some biological instinct that registered that the person in front of him had spent 12 years training to move through opposition, and that standing between her and her objective was the worst possible choice he could make in this moment. He stepped aside. Natalie moved past him and locked the door behind her. The mechanism clicked into place with a sound like a decision being finalized. Through the window, she could see the nurses gathering, Lisa at the desk, Marcus's daughter in the waiting area, her mother holding her hand, both of them watching the light in the trauma room, trying to read the future in the glow. She could see Hargrove's silhouette, turned away, his phone already in his hand, already making calculations about what came next. Webb's monitor screamed at 78% oxygen saturation. And Natalie Hayes, Senior Chief Petty Officer, decorated 3 times over, one of only 4 women in her cohort to complete SEAL team training, the woman who'd held a perimeter in Tikrit while her fire team bled out beside her, rolled up her sleeves and reached for the sterile field. The clock on the wall read 14:52. She had for minutes before his heart stopped. The spinal needle gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Natalie's hands moved with the precision of someone who had done this in desert sand, in darkness, with mortar rounds walking across the compound. 45 degrees. Below the xiphoid process. She could feel Webb's sternum beneath her fingertips, solid, a landmark she had memorized 1,000 times in another life. Through the door's small window, she could see them gathering. Nurses. Residents. The attending who had refused to come in. Their faces pressed against the glass like spectators at a drowning they had chosen not to prevent. The fluorescent hum seemed to get louder, or maybe that was just her heartbeat. Pain was information. Blood pressure was information. The absence of a carotid pulse was information that meant for minutes. She advanced the needle slowly. 1 millimeter. 2. Aspirating as she pushed forward, looking for the resistance that would tell her she had reached the fibrous pericardium. There. She felt it. The slight give of the membrane yielding to the needle's tip. 60 milliliters of blood flowed into the syringe. Dark. Thick. Evidence of tamponade. Her breath came steady and even. Not the breathing of a panicked nurse. The breathing of a combat medic who had done this while rounds impacted concrete blocks 3 feet away. Webb's blood pressure climbed on the monitor. 72. 80. 90. His eyes opened. Focused on hers. One word came out, rough and barely audible. Reaper. The color drained from her face. That call sign belonged to a woman who had died in Tikrit 6 years ago, or at least that was what she had needed everyone to believe. That was the woman locked in a cardboard box, buried deep enough that she could pretend to be someone else. Webb's lips curved into something between a smile and a grimace. I knew it. She didn't respond. Couldn't afford to. The monitor beeped steady rhythm. Sinus rhythm. His pressure holding. The immediate crisis was over. But Hargrove was already in motion outside. She could hear him through the closed door, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and urgent. 200,000 in future referrals. That was to the first board member. Mental health instability. Documented concerns from prior employment. That was her previous workplace. By the time she emerged from Webb's room 40 minutes later, the hospital investigator was already waiting with photographs. Unauthorized procedure. Practicing beyond scope. Each image a nail in the coffin of whatever identity she had tried to build here. The administrator's office was on the 4th floor. Natalie rode the elevator alone, her wet shoes leaving footprints on the polished tile. The word terminated echoed in the hallway before she even sat down. By 6 o'clock, she was standing at the security desk. The badge cutter moved with surgical precision. Click. Her identification split in half. The badge fell to the floor like a broken wing. She picked it up without bending down, just reached and grabbed it mid-bounce. Nurse Sarah Chen stood 20 feet away, deliberately looking at her phone. Rodriguez, who had worked nights with her for 2 years, suddenly found the wall very interesting. Nobody met her eyes. Nobody said a word. The cardboard box weighed almost nothing. A cracked coffee mug with a faded anchor. A dying succulent in a plastic pot, leaves drooping like surrender flags. A photograph, creased and water-damaged, of a man in dive gear with his arm around her shoulders. Tikrit, 2016. His name was Marcus. He had died clearing an IED rig building. He had been her dive buddy. Her teammate. Her brother. The rain fell in sheets across San Diego, the kind that made the streetlights blur into halos. The bus stop shelter was mostly plastic. Mostly useless. Water ran down the sides in steady rivers. Natalie sat on the bench anyway, the box balanced on her lap like a newborn. Her scrubs were soaked through. Her hair hung in ropes. A car passed with its wipers on full speed. Then another. None of them stopped. There was nothing to see here but a wet woman with a cardboard box, and the city was very good at not seeing those. She wondered if this was how it always ended, if you ran far enough and quiet enough. If you erased yourself carefully enough, did you eventually disappear completely, or did some part of the original person always leak through no matter how deep you buried it? The photograph in her hand showed a man who was dead and a woman who had also died, just more slowly, over 6 years of pretending to be ordinary. The rain hammered the shelter roof like static. Like interference. Like the sound of doors closing. Her phone didn't ring. Nobody was coming. That was the part that hurt most, not the firing, not the humiliation, not even the way her former colleagues had looked away. It was the confirmation that she had succeeded. She had become so small, so quiet, so utterly forgettable that even when she saved a man's life, it didn't matter. She was still just a nurse who had overstepped. Still just someone to be discarded. The next vehicle that pulled up to the curb wasn't a bus. The headlights were military spec, the kind that cut through rain like a scalpel. The door opened and a man in dress blue stepped out, rain streaming off his shoulders like he was moving through water that parted for him. Behind him came two more. The insignia on the first man's collar caught the streetlight. Captain. He stood in front of the bus stop shelter, rain falling around him, and looked at the woman with the cardboard box the way a person looks at someone who has been lost and has finally been found. Senior Chief Hayes. His voice carried the weight of military command, the kind that made people stand without thinking. "Sir," she said. It came out automatic. Muscle memory from a lifetime ago. The box fell from her lap. The mug broke. The photograph floated to the wet ground, face up, showing the dead man and the dead woman. The captain didn't look down. "We've been searching for you for 6 years." The Marine's daughter stepped forward, her voice steady as she read from the chart in her trembling hands. Patient states nurse is Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes. The administrator's pen stopped mid-signature. The Navy captain's jaw tightened, not in anger, but recognition. The words hung in the fluorescent-lit conference room like a live round somebody had just chambered. 7 doctors. 7 physicians who'd refused to enter that room. 7 men who turned their backs while a woman they dismissed as just a nurse held a dying veteran's life in her hands for 4 minutes and saved it. An ICU nurse pulled the file with trembling hands. Her whisper carried across the administrator's office like wind through a canyon. 3 purple hearts. Bronze star with V device. The paper scattered across the desk, photographs of a younger Natalie in desert camouflage, citations, after-action reports marked unclassified for official use only. The administrator leaned forward, reading, his face draining the color of old bone. Hargrove opened his mouth. Closed it. His lawyer touched his arm, but Hargrove shook him away, standing up from the chair where he'd been sitting, convinced he was protected, convinced his network of board members and referral kickbacks made him untouchable. A SEAL team leader stepped into the room, boots polished like mirrors, uniform pressed sharp enough to cut. His name was Commander Price. He looked at Natalie's file, then directly at Hargrove. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes held a defensive perimeter for 19 minutes in Tikrit while insurgents advanced from 3 directions. Her position was overrun. She sustained 2 gunshot wounds and continued fighting. She dragged 2 wounded Marines through a minefield to extraction. Price paused, letting the weight of each word settle. She was recommended for the Navy Cross for that action. That recommendation has been approved. That medal was waiting for her the entire time she was cleaning your cafeteria, fixing your systems, saving your patients while you tried to break her. The captain looked at the hospital administrator. She deserves better than this place. Better than him. The next words came quiet as a loaded rifle being cocked. Dr. Hargrove, you're terminated. Effective immediately. The administrator's voice carried the finality of a prison door slamming. Outside the windows, news vans were pulling into the parking lot. Someone had called CNN. Someone had tipped them to the story: a disabled war hero, a corrupt doctor, a rigged system. Hargrove's face flushed red, then pale, then something worse, the color of a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. The captain walked to the door, opened it, and gestured to a federal investigator waiting in the hallway. Medicare fraud exceeding $2 million. Phantom chemotherapy treatments billed for deceased patients. Kickback arrangements with a pharmacy supplier in Chandler, Arizona. The investigator stepped forward with a folder thick as a brick. "We've been auditing your billing since this afternoon, Dr. Hargrove. You're under federal investigation. Your medical license is suspended pending review. Your hospital privileges are revoked at Oak Creek, St. Michael's, Banner Medical, and Mercy General effective immediately." The CNN cameras caught it all. Hargrove being walked through the lobby in handcuffs, not yet arrested, but close enough to look like it. His attorney abandoning him on the spot after reviewing the fraud evidence. His practice collapsing within 72 hours. Within a week, 4 hospitals terminated his contracts. His malpractice insurance carrier dropped him. His referral network evaporated like water on hot asphalt. By the second week, he was gone from San Diego entirely, his reputation a smoking crater, his career a memory nobody wanted to remember. Natalie didn't answer her phone for 3 days. She sat in her apartment with the cardboard box on the kitchen table, the cracked mug, the dying succulent, the photo of her dive buddy who hadn't made it out of Tikrit. She stared at that photo for 8 hours at a time without blinking. The phone rang. Unknown number. She didn't answer. It rang again. And again. On the 4th day, she recognized the pattern, a military phonetic alphabet in the ring pattern. The old signal. She answered. "We found you, Reaper." Commander Price's voice was the same as it had been in Tikrit, calm as still water, steady as a sniper scope. "And we're not letting you disappear again." She heard the rotor wash of a Black Hawk in the background, the sound of boots on tarmac, the precision of an operation already in motion. "You've got 1 week. Then you're coming home." 3 months later, Hargrove was sitting at a folding table outside a strip mall in Phoenix, a hand-painted banner flapping in the desert wind, affordable supplemental insurance. His shirt was rumpled. His tie was from 2008. His hand shook when potential customers approached, which was almost never. The phone didn't ring. The referrals didn't come. Nobody wanted to buy insurance from a man whose name had been attached to Medicare fraud on national television. He aged rapidly. His face developed the hollowed-out look of someone who'd been hollowed out from the inside. 6 months after that, a Navy ceremony at Naval Base San Diego. The sun was brilliant and hard and unforgiving. Natalie stood in dress whites, the uniform she'd sworn she'd never wear again. Her hands were steady. A Navy admiral pinned the Navy Cross to her chest, the medal she'd been running from, the recognition that meant reliving the worst 17 minutes of her life, the moment when the world went very quiet and she understood that sometimes the only way forward is through. But this time, her SEAL team stood in formation behind her. Webb was there in a wheelchair, dressed in dress blues, his daughter beside him with tears streaming down her face like rain on a windshield. The hospital staff who'd stood by her, the nurses who hadn't looked away when her badge was cut in half, filled 3 rows of chairs. When the medal was pinned, Natalie's eyes found the worn combat boots displayed in a shadow box held by Commander Price. Those boots. The one she'd kept locked in her car. The one she'd carried through every humiliation, every insult, every moment of hiding. Now they were honored instead of hidden. Now they were displayed instead of ashamed. Her new office at Oak Creek Memorial had a view of the city. Director of Veteran Services. The boots sat on a shelf behind her desk where she could see them every single day. A young veteran knocked on the door, 23 years old, 2 tours, struggling with VA benefits paperwork and PTSD and the particular loneliness of coming home to people who would never understand what he'd seen. Natalie gestured for him to sit. She smiled, the first genuine smile in 5 years, and opened a folder with his name on it. "Let's get you sorted. You're not alone in this." Walking the hospital corridors now carried a different weight. Staff nodded with respect instead of averting their eyes. A young nurse asked about the shadow box with the boots. Natalie paused, touched the glass gently, her fingers steady on the frame. Those boots walked through hell. But they also walked toward people who needed help. That's the only direction worth going. The nurse understood. Not the words themselves, but the weight behind them. The cost. The choice. The absolute clarity that comes from having already lost everything and deciding to build something anyway. Have you ever judged someone based on what you could see on the surface? Have you missed the strength standing right in front of you because you weren't looking in the right way? There are hidden veterans in your community right now, in your workplace, your hospital, your neighborhood. They're the ones who stay quiet. The ones who don't talk about their service. The ones who've learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is show up and do the work without needing anyone to notice. If you recognize someone like that, tell them their strength matters. Tell them their service is honored. Don't wait for a Navy ceremony. Don't wait for cameras. Do it now. Subscribe to this channel, like this video, and comment below. Have you ever been completely wrong about someone you underestimated? Let's talk about the heroes walking among us. The ones in scrubs. The ones in silence. The ones who earned their medals the hard way.